There are a lot of connections there between early Christianity and Mithraism. I've actually been looking into it for an article I have on the side about cosmic imagery and astral imagery in early Christianity, and Mithraism comes up for that as well. There's this imagery of the baby Jesus coming down to Mary. I made the joke that it looks a little like a UFO, but that has to do with this idea of how Jesus is possibly godlike and Mary conceived him, but they never want to give any indication that God had any kind of sexual interest in Mary. I mean, there's a lot of literature on this. And so one way to get around that was to focus on this idea that he comes down from the sky, from some kind of cosmic realm, which makes a lot of sense theologically. So that's where that came from. So when I gave the didascaloi talk, I talked a little bit about how you do see that kind of imagery in the text, and then how it gets interpreted later in the artwork. But as you know, we don't have Christian art before, really, at best, the late 2nd century, but really it's a 3rd, 4th century phenomenon. If we have it before that, we don't know that we have it. We don't recognize that we're looking at it. So you have many hundreds of years of interpretation. But when you think about something like the Gospel of Matthew, you can see the star and the 3 magi coming. You can see where it all comes from. For undergrad, I went to a school called Wheaton College, which is in Massachusetts. It was great for me because a lot of the faculty there were Ivy League faculty. And so I got a lot of attention as a classicist. So I did well there, and then moved on to Harvard for my first master's degree. I was there for 3 years, and I had been a classics major in Greek specifically. And then I decided to start reading the New Testament. And so went to Harvard to study archaeology in the New Testament. And from there, I went on to Brown because at the time they had the best New Testament program. Once I got to Brown, I continued to work in archaeology, mostly Jewish diaspora archaeology at that point, and Roman archaeology. But I realized that nobody was really working on the Gospels. Everybody in my cohort wrote a dissertation on Paul. So I thought, I'm going to do something different. And it's not that I was the first person to recognize all of the references to, say, the Greek novel or philosophy in the New Testament, but I hadn't seen anybody write the book that points out that those literary networks and that kind of literature was probably more formative than any kind of oral tradition or theology, especially in the first 2 centuries. So that's what I worked on there. I was raised Catholic. My mother was actually Greek Orthodox, but she moved to Massachusetts when she married my father, and his whole family was Irish Catholic. So she got in line with that. That's the tradition I was raised in. And I also went to Catholic school. And in fact, from about, I would say, 5th grade on, I went to school in a convent. So I wasn't in convent school to become a nun, but I was being taught in their convent by nuns. So I had daily religious education. It was very disciplined, although they couldn't use the ruler anymore, if you know what I mean. And I'm still in touch actually with my religion teacher, who was also my math teacher, Sister Yvette. So it was the Sisters of the Holy Union. What happened to me is really what happens, I think, to a lot of people who go into the study of religion. You start to realize a lot of what we take as word or we take for granted as being authorized really is just going through the filter of human beings. And so the more I realized that, and also as a woman, it was difficult to be in the Catholic Church. My attitude was like, if anything goes wrong, I can default to none. But in the meantime, I think, I could explore my interest in these things. I can remember in 7th grade, Sister Yvette, she would occasionally kind of have these moments where she was talking mostly to herself, not to these little 7th graders. And she mentioned something in religion class about how Jesus wasn't white. And I just remember that moment as very formative for me, especially later on when I looked back, because I started to think to myself, well, why do we make him white then? It was those kinds of questions that really motivated my interest in the field. And so once I started to learn Greek in college, it wasn't that much of a stretch after I had mastered that to want to read the New Testament and move on. I was baptized and confirmed. I want to say I stopped going to church sometime. College becomes a point where there's a rupture where even for the holidays, you're not necessarily motivated to go. And as I continued to study, it became difficult for me to sit through a church service and not analyze it or not hear. I've been to services with students who have invited me to go with them, and but I'll hear a sermon and I'll hear mistakes. I couldn't blur those lines at a certain point. So I've never joined another religion. I've never felt the need. I try to focus on what I think are the good messages: compassion, acceptance. I've long ago stopped asking the question just because I figure I'm not going to come up with an answer, but I worry more about how to deal with people in my life and live a good life. There's something interesting in that question that goes beyond just thinking about economy, which is perception. And so I do think we still have a perception today that there are elites and then there's everyone else. And that can come down to, we're in this remarkable era where we have all these billionaires and the rest of us are struggling maybe to pay our daily bills. And I think that's one thing that I see in the ancient texts too, which is the elites are the ones, the ivory tower people say at Ivy League institutions, who are also out of touch. And so the dichotomy that I identify that you explained very well in antiquity is that it's not people who have book learning who are really smart. It's the person who has the experience of life or more practical knowledge. And so in antiquity, that would get reflected in if you are somebody who can read all of these ancient texts, that doesn't matter. What matters is, are you in tune with nature? Are you out in the field? Those are the people with true knowledge, not these elites who have money, who have this advanced education. You would sort of be born and live and work in the community in which you were raised. There wasn't that much movement. You wouldn't necessarily go away to college. It certainly happened, or you would see an elite cast of society send their kids to boarding school at a certain point. But that's unique. Most people, especially when we were more of an agricultural society, would be born and raised and live in those smaller communities. There wasn't as much connectivity. There wasn't even public education that was required. So you might not even go to school if you didn't have to. So the family unit and the church community, I think, were essentially important in those kinds of social organization. It didn't have to necessarily be church, but that kind of organization was the norm until very, very recent history. But when I was growing up, I was expected to go to college wherever I got in. And that was the key to success. The idea is you're going to pick a profession that you will survive off of, and you're going to go where the job is. You'll follow that path and you'll create your society, your community, wherever that happens to be. It's not terribly recent in the sense that I think, if I could speak plainly about this, especially evangelical Christianity started to be politically weaponized around the 1960s, 1970s. And you started to see that alignment between the evangelical right and different kinds of political narratives or concerns basically to draw out the vote. We're still living with the legacy of that. And now the concept of Christian nationalism, I would say in the last 10 years has become even more of an issue and conversation. And it's really ahistorical, this idea that it's a Christian country, we need to legislate in that direction. That was never the case. This idea that the founding fathers, that this was their intention, it's not what's encoded in our legal codes, but nonetheless, you see that narrative continue to perpetuate. It's something difficult for us to talk about for a couple of reasons, but I think one of them is that we're in it. So it's easier for the historian to look back. I think sometimes when I tell people like, oh, well, this started post-World War II, people kind of glaze over. And part of that, I think, is we have such a wave of information that hits us now and so many sources of information that you can't quite see the trajectory from the Nixon administration. And now I think it's harder to make that case unless you lived through it. But certainly those political narratives, I think, have reached a fever pitch at this point. In terms of the feminist question, I think it's a really, really good one. It does depend a little which religion you're talking about. For Catholicism, as someone from outside of Boston, as a mother, I'm not sure I would send my son to the church either, following a sex scandal. After that revelation of the extent of that scandal, people lost all faith in the institution at that point. That kind of scandal resonated throughout the country. People have often said for the Catholic Church, again, for example, that they just are not up with the times. They don't understand what daily life is like anymore. And also things like their positions on, say, birth control. There's a lot of resistance to that. And so that disconnect between what they see as the influences or realities of their daily life not matching and being made to feel guilty for those kinds of choices. I've seen that over time as being something that has led young people to also resist the structure that comes from Christian dogma or Christian rules and regulations. It's hard to trust the institution for a lot of people, especially in the LGBTQ plus community, because there's a sense that there's no place for them. Sometimes there'll be services on the beach where they play rock and roll music and they accept everybody and they're just out, and there's no building around it. And so yes, people aren't going to church, but I am seeing people gather and create new kinds of communities where they feel that they can ignore the aspects of the church, capital C, that no longer correspond to their daily lives. That sometimes gets cast as a liberal conservative problem, but it's not. That's happening across the board. That authority structure is gone, and people are now creating new communities. What's interesting about those stories is we say that people left the church, but not to sound too cliche, the church has left people too.
Constantine basically decides to no longer hold any kind of barrier between those who wish to worship Christianity or participate in it and those who don't. But we also know that to that point, Christianity was popular among Roman soldiers. Christians are being martyred in the amphitheater, thrown to the lions. That was largely overstated to be the case by Christians as sort of a strategy for cohesion. This idea that the Christians were being persecuted before this conversion experience of Constantine's, and at that point it becomes the state religion. What seems to be the case is a little bit more his mother got very into it, and his family members got into it because it was an opportunity for patronage. They could build churches. His mother goes to Jerusalem to collect relics, and this becomes a status symbol for her. But his own triumphal arch in Rome, he again never puts any Christian imagery on it, which is really interesting. Certainly what happens over even the time of Constantine's reign is that you do have the institutionalization become stronger for those who are representative bishops and leaders of the church. After around 323, when they do start making those very firm decisions. And the other thing that I tend to look at is things like artwork. And that tells us a lot about the administrative reforms and things that start to take place to sort of identify what is going to be an orthodox opinion or an orthodox approach to Christianity versus otherwise. Was there division within Christianity even beforehand? And that's absolutely the case. I don't think there was ever a point where Christianity was settled. There might be an authorized legal Orthodox opinion, and that's the thing I would want to look at. But even from the time of Paul and Peter, they don't agree. You have something there called the Jerusalem Council, where it seems that there are divisions along the lines of whether or not, quote unquote, new converts, so non-Jews coming into the fold of that developing religion, need to do things like follow the Jewish law. And Peter and James seem to think so, from what we can reconstruct, that if you're going to join this Christ group, that you're going to observe dietary laws and participate in the traditional covenantal actions like circumcision that were part of membership within Judaism. Whereas Paul says no, that there's a different covenant now between Gentiles and the Jewish God, and those things aren't necessary. And so they sort of decide at the Jerusalem Council, we're just going to go our separate ways. We see this differently. There's not going to really be resolution to this. And so they part ways at that point. And so that seems to be the history of Christianity. You do have these councils that meet and make decisions. The Nicene Creed was really focused on some of the Trinitarian issues. That is, making those official determinations on issues of theology was really the focus of those meetings. It is about what gets supported ultimately by the infrastructure of the Roman state. This transition period from, say, Constantine to the later 4th century. By this point in the late 4th century, you're still seeing art and various kinds of artistic depictions recognizing what we might call the Greco-Roman gods. But by the time you're getting into this period of the late 4th century into the 5th century, that's the balance of power shifts. And now you're having more Christian art, Christian iconography, buildings, temples or other kinds of civic spaces turning into Christian spaces. We can see this in some of the debates over canon. So which texts belong in and which ones belong out. And that's often even more than, say, individual councils, where you would have a lot of fighting take place because some people would think one text is authentic to Paul and another would say not, and they would be debating the individual issues within those texts. See, now the problem is the Orthodox Church often, the word in Latin is damnatio memoriae. They would kind of excise these quote unquote heretics from the historical record. One famous figure that's a little bit earlier is Marcion. He was considered heretical by the later church, even though he had a pretty significant following. So Marcion really loved Paul, but didn't love the Gospels. So he would want to dismiss some of the canonical Gospels and some of the ideas about Christ and the nature of Christ as like always God's son. When does he become God's son? Those sorts of debates are what's going on with these different figures. And they would go from town to town. And in some cases, it seems like they may have actually killed some of the people there. But at minimum, they would burn their libraries if they had any books at all that were considered heretical or not part of what was decided in some council elsewhere. They would just destroy anything that they deemed to be outside of that Orthodox opinion. We know there was a monastery in this place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt. It's kind of south, down the Nile River, around the period of time we're talking about, 4th to 6th century, more or less. And what must have happened is some monk knew they were coming because he took all of these texts that were kind of part of the canon being celebrated in that location and that he knew might get excised or destroyed. They're called codices, and he put them into jars and rolled them into a cave and hid them. There are hundreds of them. There was a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So not the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel. And this one was about what do you do if you have a child who's the son of God and is born with all those miraculous powers already, but is not mature enough to know how to wield them responsibly. Baby Jesus will do things like if a playmate bumps him in the schoolyard, he zaps them dead. Eventually, one kid accidentally dies from falling from a roof, a total accident, but all the parents in town kind of, barge down to Mary and Joseph's house and like knock on the door and say, he's at it again, he's killing all the kids. You have to stop him. He's a horrible little shit throughout the entire text until he gets falsely accused. And then he kind of has this realization he better change his ways. So then he starts doing all the things you see in the gospel. He starts multiplying wheat when there's a bit of a famine in town. He starts helping Joseph with the carpentry business. When one kid dies, by some kind of accident, he resurrects them. Christianity, along with Judaism and Islam, so these what are traditionally called Abrahamic religions, do offer an idea of some kind of quote unquote salvation or a life beyond this one for those who are essentially in the in group, those who are participating and recognizing the basic tenets and dogmas of those religions. And that kind of salvation is usually promised to be something like eternal life, but a life where you are free from the threat of mortality, but also things like pain, sickness, and also you'll have the opportunity to rejoin your family members and loved ones in that afterlife scenario. And so in that respect, salvation is there usually, so in the case of Christianity, as a remedy to what's perceived to be an ill about the mortal condition. And so that can range from something like the concept of original sin, which is much later within Christian theology, but captures this idea that there is a basic injustice with the mortal condition that will be resolved thanks to God's intercession, or you might even say God's grace, to the people who follow the proper religious track. They will be rewarded with that kind of quote unquote salvation, but some kind of eternal life afterwards. Salvation as a carrot works very effectively in two functions. One is to keep people in line during their lifetime in order to reap the reward at the end time. And that reward is almost always in life or in death focused on this idea of social relationships. I mean, this idea that you're going to be able to reclaim the self that you imagined in this life and the social relationships that you had. And so the church, especially, has a very effective mechanism with this promise of salvation to not only keep people within the fold, but keep them within the fold within those social groups that are so important to their day-to-day lives. So the family, and I would say more in the past, even whole neighborhoods, but whole communities. I think people replicated this down the line throughout their lives because it became so essential, both in terms of things like not only your personal lives, but your profession. Since the time of Paul, Peter, and James, I can't think of a moment when that eternal strife didn't exist, except perhaps, when Jesus was here. Our earliest evidence for Christianity, the letters of Paul, show that kind of internal strife. And in fact, you can make an argument that any of the subsequent documents we have, like the Gospels, are there to try to quell and create more cohesion because of the strife that we know is there. Not even the Gospels totally agree with each other. And you have different theological perspectives in each one of those as well. So there have been contestations over the correct practices, what we might call the correct theology, and the correct perspective on how to be a Christian for as long as we've even had that word. As we start to see institutionalization for Christianity, even before Constantine, what we have is a great deal of infighting, overt disagreements, and even disagreements about what texts are orthodox or canonical and which ones aren't. So, yeah, there's never been a moment when there hasn't been controversy or competition. The number of different Christian denominations tells me that the denominations that are dominant, that have had or enjoyed a great deal of stability over the past generations, are struggling and no longer meeting people where they're at in their day-to-day lives, in their philosophies about their lives, or in how they are practicing their personal lives. And I think that when you start to see this sort of multiplicity of perspectives emerging and people coalescing around different centers of authority, it's because those previous centers of authority, again, no longer work for people. So lifting the veil on when theological explanations no longer make sense in the face of scientific explanations or just, again, common sense explanations. And so when those things come to a head or come into tension and there's resistance, active resistance from the church for change, people will make change. And we've seen that over and over again since the 20th century, especially.